Jaden had always been close to his younger sister, Maya. She was shy, quiet, and rarely complained, even though their family had been through a rough few years. After their mom left, their dad had to work 2 jobs, which meant Jaden was left to look out for Maya more than ever. One night, Jaden was lying in bed when he heard it for the first time, soft, stifled sobs coming from the direction of Maya's room. He wanted to go to her, to comfort her, but something held him back. He thought maybe she wanted her privacy, maybe it was a one-time thing. But it wasn't. Every night, the sobbing returned, growing louder and more heartbreaking. Jaden tried to ask Maya if something was wrong, but she just smiled, shaking her head, telling him everything was fine. But the sobbing continued, night after night. He could feel her sadness, even if she tried to hide it. One night, Jaden couldn't take it anymore. He crept down the hallway to Maya's room, pausing outside her door. He could hear the crying on the other side, low and haunting. But there was something different this time, another sound, faint, like whispers. It sent a chill down his spine. Slowly, he opened the door and slipped inside. "Maya?" he whispered, but she didn't respond. Her bed was empty. Then he saw it. Maya's closet door was slightly ajar, the sobs louder, coming from within. Jaden's heart raced as he stepped toward the closet. He could see Maya huddled inside, her arms wrapped around herself, crying softly, her head down. He knelt beside her and gently touched her shoulder. "Maya," he whispered, trying to keep his voice calm. She looked up at him, and his stomach dropped. Her eyes were wide, but empty, almost as though she wasn't really seeing him. "I'm sorry, Jaden," she whispered, her voice hollow. "I didn't mean to let it out." "Let what out?" he asked, confused. At that moment, he heard a creak behind him. Turning, he saw the shadow of a figure standing at the closet door. It was tall, its limbs too long, its eyes glowing with a cold, empty light. Jaden froze as the figure extended one bony hand toward him. "It was in the walls," Maya whispered, her voice shaking. "It told me things, made me promise to keep it a secret. But I tried to make it go away, I did, Jaden, I tried." The figure moved closer, and Jaden felt its cold breath against his skin. He grabbed Maya's hand, pulling her from the closet, and they ran together out of the room, down the hall, and out the front door, not stopping until they were out of the house. They never went back to that house. Their dad eventually moved them, never fully understanding why the kids refused to return. But Jaden could still hear the cries from those nights, even years later, the hollow sobs that echoed through the walls, and the whispers that he would never forget. Every night, around 2 a.m. Darius would hear his sister, Maya, crying in her room. It had been happening for weeks. At first, he thought she was just going through a rough time. Their parents had divorced recently, and he knew it was especially hard on her. But this was different. Her crying was strange, muffled, almost strained, like she was trying to hold it back but couldn't. One night, he knocked softly on her door. "Maya, are you okay?" No answer, just the same soft, muffled crying. He tried to open the door, but it was locked. "Please talk to me, Maya," he whispered through the door, feeling helpless. But after a moment, the crying stopped. He stood there in the dark, waiting, but there was only silence. The next day, he brought it up, hoping she'd confide in him. "Maya, I heard you crying last night. Are you okay?" She looked at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" "I haven't been crying," she said firmly, brushing him off before he could press her. Darius felt uneasy. He knew what he'd heard. But every time he brought it up, she denied it. Determined to find out what was really happening, he decided to stay awake that night. Around 2 a.m. it began again. Soft, heart-wrenching sobs. Darius crept out of his bed and walked to her door, but this time, he noticed something chilling. The cries weren't coming from her room. They were coming from the attic. Confused and scared, he slowly made his way up the stairs and opened the attic door. He could still hear Maya's voice crying, but the attic was pitch black, and there was no one there. He called out her name, but all he heard in response was her voice, sobbing in the darkness. Suddenly, he felt a presence behind him. He spun around to find his real sister, Maya, standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at him in fear. "What are you doing up there, Darius?" she asked, her voice trembling. Darius glanced back into the dark attic, the sound of crying still faintly echoing from somewhere deep within. He backed away, closing the attic door behind him. "Maya, if you weren't crying, then who?" The house was silent. Maya looked just as terrified as he felt. They never went back into the attic. And the next night, when the crying started again, they both lay in bed, wide awake, listening, too afraid to ever investigate the truth. Marcus was only 12 when his sister Jasmine started crying every night. They shared a room in their small apartment, but she had recently moved to the basement to give him more space. The first time he heard her crying, he thought it might just be a bad dream, but the crying didn't stop. Every night, around midnight, he would hear her soft sobs drifting up the basement stairs and down the hall to his room. At first, he tried to ignore it. He told himself that maybe she just needed time to work through whatever was bothering her. But as the nights went on, the crying grew louder and more desperate. Her sobs turned to wails, and he would lie in bed, gripping his pillow, feeling his heart race. One night, he couldn't take it anymore. He got out of bed and crept down the hallway, his bare feet brushing the cold wooden floor. The crying stopped as he reached the basement door. Heart pounding, he took a deep breath and slowly pushed it open, descending into the basement. "Jazz?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. There was no response. He switched on the light. The basement was empty, her bed made, and her things neatly organized. Confused, he checked around the room, but there was no sign of his sister. He walked back up to his parents' room and knocked softly on their door. His mom opened it, her face sleepy and confused. "What is it, Marcus?" "Mom, where's Jasmine?" he asked. I heard her crying again." She frowned and looked down at the floor before meeting his eyes. "Marcus," she said gently, "Jasmine. Jasmine passed away last year. Remember?" The words hit him like a punch in the chest. Memories flooded back, the accident, the funeral, the empty room after she was gone. He'd blocked it out, buried the memory deep because it hurt too much to remember. But I've been hearing her, every night," he stammered. "She's been crying." His mom's face grew pale. "We've been hearing it too," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Every night, without fail, I would hear my little sister, Maya, crying alone in her room. At first, I thought it was nightmares, maybe a bad day at school. But as the nights went on, I noticed a pattern. the crying always started at exactly 2:17 a.m., echoing down the hall from her closed bedroom door. It was soft, almost muffled, but somehow it felt wrong. One night, I decided I'd had enough. I crept to her door, quietly turning the knob, and peeked in. There she was, sitting on her bed, shoulders hunched, her face buried in her hands. She didn't look up as I entered, she was just sobbing, like she didn't even know I was there. Gently, I sat on the edge of her bed and put my arm around her. "Maya," I whispered. The sobbing stopped instantly. She froze, then slowly turned to face me. But what I saw wasn't Maya. Her eyes were blank, almost glazed over, like she was staring straight through me. I was so terrified I almost ran out of the room, but I stayed, shaking her gently. "Maya, are you okay?" I asked again. Nothing. She didn't blink, didn't move, just that blank, empty stare. Finally, I heard her whisper, "He's coming." That was all she said before lying down, closing her eyes, and going back to sleep. I sat there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. The next night, the crying began again at 2:17 a.m. I wanted to go back, to see if she'd say anything else, but something in me knew I shouldn't. The look in her eyes, the tone in her voice, it wasn't Maya. I could feel it. Days turned into weeks, and every night, the crying would start, just as soft and haunting as the night before. Then one evening, I finally broke down and asked my mom if she had heard Maya crying, too. She gave me a strange look, confusion and pity mixing on her face. "She's just going through a rough patch," she said. "Losing a sister can be hard." I felt my blood run cold. "What are you talking about? Maya's right there." My mom's face dropped. She looked at me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your sister passed away in a car accident 3 months ago." It was like everything came crashing down at once. I ran back to my room, my mind spinning, trying to convince myself that it was all some horrible joke. But I knew. Deep down, I knew. The Maya I'd been hearing every night wasn't my sister anymore. And that night, at exactly 2:17 a.m., I didn't just hear her crying. I heard footsteps coming down the hall, stopping right outside my door. And then, in that same haunting, empty voice, I heard her whisper, "He's here." Since that night, I haven't heard her again. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still feel a presence lingering outside my door, waiting for me to open it.